Hello, everyone. It is Friday, September 11th. Welcome to another episode of Together San Diego. I'm your host, Luis Cruz, Community Relations Director for the San Diego Union-Tribune. And joining me this afternoon is Barry Jagoda, author of Journeys with Jimmy Carter and Other Adventures in Media. Barry, thank you so much for joining me today as the nation marks the 19th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. It's a day of remembrance, and today you'll be walking us through a lot of American history. So thank you for that.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Louis.
Thank you. Journeys with Jimmy Carter and Other Adventures in Media reveals a close working relationship with Jimmy Carter when he ran for president in 1976. Tell us more about your book and what readers can expect.
Well, good. I'm delighted to do so. One of the Union-Tribune reporter did a story on this book and on my writing of it, and she said this book is more than just about the 39th president of the United States, which I thought was a good comment. There was interest on the part of the publisher in using the Jimmy Carter name since he's so famous, and I had no objections to that since I did work for President Carter when he ran for president in 1976, and I worked in the White House after that. Of course, that was a real thrill. At the time, I was 32 years old, which made me one of the senior members of the Carter staff. People may not remember this, but a lot of people in their youth got involved with Carter, in part because they liked him, and I think in part because they were just taking a chance. But as a senior member of the Carter campaign, there you see a picture of the president and his press secretary, principal media advisor, Jody Powell, in the background. And we're taking a look at preparing for the 1976 presidential debates, in which I had a substantial role. We can come back and talk about that if you want in a moment. But the reporter for your newspaper said this book was more than about, as I said, more than about the President Carter, and because it actually is my story, coming of age and such. But before I got involved with Carter, I had a substantial career in journalism, in broadcast journalism particularly, and we can talk about that. But it's the past there is the prologue to my Carter experience. I had worked as a senior producer at CBS News, helping Walter Cronkite cover the moon landing, and also there you see this is a treasured photograph. The photograph itself is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but this is a variation on that photograph because on the left side there it says "Best wishes to Barry Jagoda from the photographer Neil Armstrong." And there, Armstrong has taken a picture of his buddy, Buzz Aldrin, and on the right side it says, "To Barry Jagoda with best wishes, Buzz Aldrin." This picture is included in the memoir because it's symbolic of the kind of reporting that one had to do in covering the space program. One had to get to know all the astronauts, and my particular job was to be the producer of the CBS coverage in Houston, and that's where one had to know the nuts and bolts of the space program in case something went wrong or as things went right. So that background to the Carter story is something that I emphasize in the book, and that the Union-Tribune reporter covering the book, writing about the book, noticed that it's not just about the 39th president.
So Barry, you worked in network news and for a number of years, and tell us how you got involved with Jimmy Carter and his administration.
Well, for sure, that's a fairly interesting story. By the time 1976 rolled around, I had 10 years of experience as a broadcast journalist. I had gone to a graduate school at Columbia University's School of Journalism, and shortly after graduating with a master's degree in journalism, I got hired at NBC News and worked there for nearly 2 years, and then went over to CBS News, as I've described before. But the story about my involvement with Carter is kind of interesting. I had 10 years of solid journalism work, and by then the stories seemed to be coming around again, and I was a little bored. But in '76, when Carter first ran, he was being covered by a distinguished person who was eventually a distinguished broadcast correspondent, but at the time was just a regular correspondent, Ed Bradley. Bradley is known probably to most viewers as a 60 Minutes correspondent. But anyway, the fellow we saw in the picture before, Carter's main media advisor, Jody Powell, who ultimately, there he is in the background, ultimately became press secretary to the president. Bradley and Powell were having a chat, and Powell said, we really don't know that much about television. I wish we could find somebody who could help us out. And Bradley said, well, you might talk to this guy, Barry Jagoda, who I had heard after 10 years, he was looking for a change. And so I got a call from Powell, and he invited me to come up to New Hampshire. Carter, who had come from being virtually unknown to doing well in the first primary in '76 in Iowa, had more name recognition. And so I went up to see Powell, and we had a drink in the bar there in the hotel, the main political hotel in Manchester, New Hampshire. And Powell said, well, I think maybe it's time for you to have a chat with the governor, Governor Carter. So that was set up. And first thing, Carter, who never suffered from a lack of self-confidence, he looked at me and he said, well, how would you change me? And I said, well, Governor, I wouldn't so much change you. I guess he probably thought I might have been prepared to say, well, you shouldn't mumble, you should do this, or you should do that. I said, I would just let you know the effect of your words and your actions, how they would be perceived by the broadcast networks, and the major media, radio, television, and print journalism. And he looked at me, he said, so you would let me know what they might think of my actions and my words. And I said, well, that's exactly it. And at that point, Carter, after he asked me a couple of other questions, and he called Powell over. He said, well, this guy could probably help us if he wants to. And so that's how I got involved with Jimmy Carter in 1976. It was a real thrill. I mean, I wasn't naive or a child at that point, but presidential campaign. And at that point, Carter was still way behind. Nobody knew who he was. But the secret to those presidential primaries is if you win one, you get invited by the network correspondents, if that's properly set up, and you get a bounce, a momentum to move forward. And that is what happened in the situation with me and Carter in 1976.
And so then you joined the campaign, and is that you with Walter Mondale here?
That's right. Once the nominees were set, 3 or 4 months after I first met Carter there, Carter won the Democratic nomination, and he selected Mondale, a veteran governor and senator from Minnesota, to be his running mate. And that year, for the first time in 1976, not since 1960, when there had been the famous Kennedy-Nixon debates, there hadn't been any debates at all in the presidential encounter. But in 1976, both the incumbent, President Gerald Ford, and the opponent, Carter, saw a need to debate. And so the presidential and vice presidential debates were resumed for the first time. They, of course, were largely television events. And so along with another Carter media advisor, Jerry Rafshoon, and Jody Powell, the three of us became the Carter representatives to set up the debates. And that's a whole separate story. I write about the presidential debates in the memoir, but it was something we had to reinvent because, as I say, there hadn't been these debates at that level for a long time.
Well, it sounds like Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale were very lucky to have you. How has television and news media outreach changed? How's it different from back then from now?
Well, okay, that's a very good question, Louis. Actually, the on the lucky to have me thing, I don't want to be immodest, but at that point, there was a journalist by the name of Theodore White who had been chronicling presidential elections since 1960 in a series of books called The Making of the President. And he wrote in his book on the 76 campaign, he said Barry Jagoda was Jimmy Carter's secret weapon, which I was glad to see it, but it may have been an exaggeration, although White was a very focused and serious journalist. So now you've wondered what happened. We had the nomination, and then we had the face-off with President Ford, and the rest of it is history.
And so, Jimmy Carter ends up getting elected. You said you're 32 years old when you end up at the White House. What was that like?
Well, first of all, as I said, I was one of the in age. I was one of the senior members of the Carter administration. My first job was to be a spokesperson for the presidential transition. Carter and Powell and would situated themselves in the Carter's hometown village of Plains, where people would come down to be interviewed for cabinet posts and such. But meanwhile, in Washington, we had a transition headquarters, and every day hundreds of people would come there and knock on the door and try to get an appointment to talk about how they could be in the administration. Of course, as a spokesperson for the transition in Washington, I was polite to everyone. Eventually, we had a full presidential personnel office, and I could refer some of these office seekers to them. But having all these people, a senator here, a lobbyist there, coming and knocking on the door and wanting to get involved in the administration was something out of a storybook. But anyway, the cabinet was set, and the inauguration was set, and Carter and his wife, in a surprise, which was at that time unheard of, they got out of their limousine the last few blocks before the White House and started walking. This gave the Secret Service some qualms, but it was an example of Carter's effort to say, I'm going to stay in close touch with the American people. You know, Louis, one thing that should be mentioned here further into the administration, I had numerous assignments from Carter, and I think this was giving him a report on our effort to find a director for the National Endowment for the Humanities. But anyway, I was going to tell you that, let's see, I don't want to lose my train of thought here. Your question was what was it like going?
Well, yeah, I mean, and then you had a front row seat to many historic events once Jimmy Carter was elected. What stands out? What are some of those stories you can talk about?
Well, for sure. Of course, as the first the television advisor and then special assistant to the president for media, anything that had to do with television became the staff person to handle it. For example, one of the most famous historical aspects of Carter's career, he had gone to the Naval Academy. He did fairly well. Was in the middle of his class, and when he finished the Naval Academy, he'd been trained as an engineer in college, and he wanted to join the submarine service. And in order to become a member of the submarine service, you had to go through a very rigorous interview by the head of the service itself, Admiral Hyman Rickover. And the story is told that Carter went to the young midshipman, went to be interviewed by Admiral Rickover. And at one point in the conversation, Rickover said to Carter, "Well, have you always done your best?" And Carter, who had a penchant for telling the truth, said, "Well, no, sir, I guess I haven't always done my best." And Rickover said to him, "Why not your best?" And that phrase became the title of Jimmy Carter's campaign biography, Why Not Your Best? Well, anyway, a few months into the presidential term in early 1977, Admiral Rickover was invited, or somehow got himself invited, to the White House, and President Carter and the Admiral were there to launch a nuclear submarine by pushing a button, and a submarine would go into the sea in Groton, Connecticut. And because this was widely seen as a television event, the television networks were not covering it live at that point, but were certainly filming it for later use. And so they pushed the button, the submarine was launched, and that was, as far as Carter was concerned, that was the end of the event. He went away, at which point the Admiral looked around and he said, where's Jimmy? I have these papers for Jimmy. And he looked at me and said, "Here, take care of these. Be sure you get them to Jimmy." So, of course, presidents receive huge amounts of paperwork and data and suggestions and ideas every day. And so I took the material and kind of looked at it, and then decided I would give it to the staff secretary, a fellow named Rick Hutchinson, who coordinated all those incoming paperwork for the president's later examination, reading, and what have you. But so that was a Rickover story, there's a lot of stories about the White House and the presidency, but most of my involvement had to do with the things that were called television events. Carter and his wife Rosalind had appreciated the efforts that President Kennedy and Jackie had undertaken in their presidential administration. What would have been decades ago, earlier, inviting persons from the arts. And in this case, one of the first persons that was invited was the distinguished pianist Vladimir Horowitz. And so Horowitz and I were chatting, and pretty soon it was ready for the concert to go forward. But it was an example there of big time stuff going on in the White House, and a thrill to be part of it. And you were going to ask me another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, you brought up the White House. Let's talk a little bit about current times here. You used some strong words when you mentioned President Trump in the book. What do you think is the main difference between Jimmy Carter and President Trump?
Well, when you say main difference, that's not difficult for me to comment on, because when Carter first ran for president, he had a phrase that he used very often. He said, "I will never lie to the American people. The American people deserve a president as good as they are themselves." And really, in 1976, Carter, whose opponent was the incumbent president, Gerald Ford, was not so much running against Ford as he was running against Nixon, who by then had been disgraced and left office. And so there you had Carter saying, "I'll never lie to you," and Nixon, who had less of a track record. But here I think we find biggest difference in 2020, in that between these two, the noble politician Carter, who said he would never lie, and President Trump, who is really not expected to tell the truth. So I would say truth telling is a fundamental difference, the biggest difference between those two.
Barry, what media outlets do you follow?
Well, it's a good question. First of all, just a piece of history here. In this 76 period, there were really only three major television networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC, with their nightly news, and the print journalism. Ringing in my ears as a young broadcaster was a comment from Walter Cronkite, the distinguished anchor of CBS Evening News. He said, these news broadcasts are only 22 minutes long. You can't get too much more than a headline service. So it's critical that if you want to know what's going on, that you read newspapers. And to this day, although the media picture has changed quite a bit, which we should talk about, but to this day, we get here in our driveway, we get the Los Angeles Times and the New York Times and the San Diego Union-Tribune and the Wall Street Journal, and we try to absorb those every day. That's all. It takes a lot of time, and but it seems worthwhile. But the main difference between now and then has been the I was going to say appearance, the creation of there were the legacy media, the ABC, CBS, and NBC, but also the great point of view news organizations like Fox News to the right and MSNBC to the left, and CNN, which is perhaps a little to the left as well. So you now have 6 major broadcast outlets, broadcast and cable outlets, to say nothing of the hundreds of point of view social media outlets. So you have to be very careful. You can find any point of view that you're really looking for these days. And I remember in earlier days, someone said, well, someday there'll be a newspaper created just for you, with just the news that you want to get. And unfortunately, that has come true to some extent, because depending on your political position, you can find a media outlet to support it. And so that can be very dangerous, because if you're just getting what you think you want to know, you may not get a larger view of reality.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, this country is so divided at the moment. President Trump calls news organizations fake news. And many people believe talk show hosts are now news anchors. They apparently can't tell the difference between someone just giving their opinion and someone actually delivering the news. So they think everything that's on TV now is news. In your opinion, though, what does the news media need to do to gain people's trust again?
Well, first of all, every time I hear President Trump, use the word fake news, it makes my blood boil, because it's an attack on news organizations and really on the First Amendment. To start with, everyone is entitled to their opinion, news person or not. But it now becomes critical that people in positions of responsibility in journalism must pay careful attention to what they're writing and reporting, because there is this question that you raise of public trust, and how do you gain public trust and how do you lose public trust? But the most important thing is to try to stay in the middle and report the news not merely based on one's own opinion, but what a consensus of facts bring broadcasters to their position of responsibility.
Now, Barry, you say your book offers a nonpartisan citizen's guide to 2020 voting. How so?
Well, I I'm not particularly enamored of President Trump in the narrative of my book, but it's by the time the memoir gets to the end, chapter 18, I have suggested that regardless of who you're for in the presidential election, let's take that for example, it's important that you do something, not merely get out to vote, but share your views via email. You can not with very little difficulty get a Twitter account, and you can then bring to the public discussion one's own sense of how to participate as a responsible citizen. So if you merely want to use your email and send email messages to your friends or people who you have a trusting relationship with, you can call attention to what one candidate or another is saying, and if you think it's outrageous, mention that in an email. But it's not that difficult for an ordinary citizen to get involved in politics. The main thing is to vote, of course, and in 2020, the critical issue is to make sure that your own vote counts, either on the day that you go to the polls or through advanced voting, and that's not such a difficult thing. If you're going to vote by mail, now's the time to get your vote in.
All right, we are chatting with Barry Jagoda, author of Journeys with Jimmy Carter and Other Adventures in Media. There's the book. Barry, where can people pick up your book?
Well, this book is widely available. It's certainly available through Amazon. There's a hardcover version and a softbound and an electronic version, and they are varying prices from $7 to $30. So Amazon's a good place. Not so long ago, I had a book signing here in San Diego at the Prominent Bookstore, and the Union-Tribune had run some calendar notices saying you can go to the bookstore, and Jagoda will be there, and he'll be happy to. They'll sell you a book, and he'll inscribe something in your book. So that was one way. But I'm trying to let people know that they can buy this book with no trouble at all. And the main place to get this book is at your favorite bookstore, and they're all available. You know, the book industry is such a interesting. There's one main wholesaler, and bookstores primarily get their books from this wholesaler. So if somebody goes up to the bookstore, your bookstore counter, and says, "I want to buy Jagoda's book, Journeys," and they don't have it in stock, they can easily get it from their wholesaler. So any bookstore is a good place to get this book.
All right, Barry, you are full of information. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I appreciate this opportunity. I'll tell you why. The Union-Tribune is now my hometown newspaper. And one thing that people should try to depend on is their hometown newspaper. And that's what I have done this season so far. So read the newspapers and pay attention to what's going on around you, and make sure that your own vote counts.
All right. Well, thank you for those kind words, Barry. Thank you, Barry Jagoda, author of Journeys with Jimmy Carter and Other Adventures in Media. Thank you for sharing your stories with us.
Well, thank you for the hospitality. It's been good to think about some of these issues, and your questions have been thought-provoking. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you again for sharing. Really appreciate it, and thank you at home for watching. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Good deal.